if no one forced them to work, if refusal carried no punishment, and if doing nothing was always allowed, then why did time itself begin to feel heavier with every passing day? At first, the announcement did not land with the weight one might expect, because it was delivered calmly, without emphasis or ceremony, as though it were a minor detail rather than a condition capable of reshaping daily life. And for that reason, many of the men did not immediately understand that something fundamental had changed. They were told what was available, not what was required. And the difference between those two ideas seemed insignificant in the moment, because habits still guided behavior and routine still filled the hours, leaving little room for reflection during the early days. Work continued much as it had before, with groups moving where they had been assigned, tools passing from hand to hand, and time measured by repetition rather than intention. Yet beneath this surface continuity, a quiet shift had already begun to take place. What made this shift difficult to recognize was the absence of pressure, because no one stood watching to ensure compliance. No voice counted hours or demanded output, and no visible consequence waited at the edge of refusal, creating a space where action appeared optional rather than expected. In such an environment, effort began to lose its urgency, not because it was discouraged, but because nothing depended on it in any obvious way. And when effort carries no immediate meaning, the mind begins to question why it should be sustained at all. Some continued to work simply because they always had, moving through familiar motions without examining their purpose, while others slowed gradually, not out of defiance or fatigue, but because the internal signal that once pushed them forward had grown faint. No one spoke openly about the change at first, because there was nothing dramatic to describe, only a subtle loosening of structure that made each decision feel slightly heavier than before, as though choice itself had gained weight in the absence of instruction. The tools remained where they had always been, the tasks remained available, and the days remained long. Yet something about the relationship between effort and time had shifted, creating pauses where none had existed before and stretching moments that once passed without notice. Without obligation to measure themselves against productivity, the men began to measure themselves against something less defined, an internal sense of readiness that rarely arrived and was difficult to identify when it did. This created a strange tension because doing nothing was no longer a failure, yet doing something no longer felt necessary. And in that space between permission and purpose, motivation began to erode quietly. The absence of enforcement removed the familiar structure against which resistance had once been shaped, leaving no clear boundary to push against and no obvious reason to test limits that no longer announced themselves. As days passed, the option to refuse remained unused by many, not because it was feared, but because it required an active decision, and active decisions demand clarity that had begun to dissolve within the slow rhythm of waiting. Each morning arrived without urgency. Each task presented itself without insistence, and each evening closed without evaluation, reinforcing the sense that effort and rest carried equal weight in a place where neither was demanded. In this way, inaction did not arrive suddenly, nor did it announce itself as a choice, but emerged gradually through countless small moments in which doing nothing felt marginally easier than deciding to act. What made this process so effective was its subtlety, because no one could point to a specific day or hour when effort lost its meaning. And without such a moment, there was nothing to resist and nothing to reclaim. The men remained aware that work was possible, just as they remained aware of many other possibilities that were never tested. Yet awareness alone proved insufficient to generate movement in the absence of necessity. Over time, the energy once reserved for action was redirected inward, toward maintaining balance, conserving strength, and avoiding the discomfort of decisions that carried no clear reward. The environment did not encourage idleness. nor did it punish it. And this neutrality allowed stillness to settle naturally, reshaping behavior without ever appearing to do so. By the end of this early phase, effort had not disappeared, but it had become optional in a way that subtly undermined its role in structuring the day, leaving behind a pattern of waiting that felt neither forced nor chosen, but simply present. If you'd like to hear future stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel. As the days accumulated and the option to refuse remained consistently available, the men began to sense that the freedom they had been given did not behave as freedom usually does. Because instead of expanding possibility, it introduced a quiet pressure that followed them through each unremarkable hour. What had initially felt like relief slowly transformed into uncertainty. Because when effort is no longer demanded, the reason for effort must be supplied from within, and that internal source proved less reliable than anyone had expected. They were no longer responding to orders or schedules with defined consequences, but to an open condition that required personal judgment, and judgment, when exercised repeatedly without guidance, tends to exhaust rather than empower. Some attempted to maintain their previous routines out of habit alone, waking with intention and moving toward work without being asked. Yet even these efforts felt different because they were no longer anchored to necessity, and without necessity, purpose began to feel fragile. Others delayed, telling themselves they would decide later, not because they had chosen rest, but because the act of choosing had become unexpectedly difficult, and delay offered temporary relief from the discomfort of decision. In this environment, refusal did not appear as a bold act of defiance, but as a passive state that required no explanation, and over time this passivity began to feel like the default rather than the exception. The absence of visible reaction reinforced this shift, because nothing changed whether a man worked or remained still, and when outcomes do not differ, the motivation to act erodes quietly. Days passed in which the difference between effort and inaction became increasingly subtle, marked less by external result and more by internal sensation, as fatigue and uncertainty blurred together. Conversation reflected this change, not through complaint or protest, but through omission, as discussions about tasks and plans grew shorter and less frequent, replaced by silence or by observations that required no response. What unsettled them most was not the stillness itself, but the realization that it was spreading without resistance, because no rule prevented action and no fear discouraged it, leaving only hesitation to stand in the way. The option to refuse remained untouched for many, not because it was rejected, but because it no longer felt like an option at all, having merged seamlessly into the rhythm of the day. Without deadlines or evaluation, time lost its urgency, stretching into long, undifferentiated intervals that encouraged waiting rather than movement. The mind adapted by conserving energy, avoiding unnecessary exertion not only of the body, but of intention itself, as though intention were a resource better saved than spent. In this way, refusal became heavier than work, because work at least followed a familiar pattern, while refusal required ongoing awareness of choice, and awareness, when prolonged, becomes burdensome. What had once been a simple decision now demanded internal justification, and the absence of consequence removed the external signals that might have made such justification easier. As a result, many found themselves doing nothing not because they had decided to refuse, but because they had never fully decided to act, remaining suspended between possibilities that no longer compelled movement. The camp did not respond to this shift because there was nothing to respond to, and its continued neutrality confirmed the sense that no adjustment was necessary, further stabilizing the state of inaction. By the end of this phase, refusal had ceased to feel like a choice and had become instead a condition, quietly maintained not by resistance, but by the accumulated weight of decisions left unmade. As the pattern continued without interruption, the men gradually stopped perceiving their inaction as a response to circumstance and began to experience it as a natural state, because repetition, when left unchallenged, has a way of redefining what feels ordinary and what feels unnecessary. The absence of pressure no longer registered as freedom, but as background, something so consistently present that it no longer invited evaluation, allowing days to unfold without the friction that once accompanied decision-making. What had initially required conscious delay now occurred automatically, as moments that might have led to effort passed quietly without triggering reflection, and the space where intention once formed grew increasingly silent. They did not discuss this change openly, not because it was forbidden, but because it lacked a clear shape, unfolding internally rather than through observable behavior. And internal shifts rarely announce themselves in ways that invite conversation. Tasks remained available, tools remained within reach, and time remained abundant. Yet none of these elements carry the urgency they once had, because urgency depends on contrast, and contrast had slowly dissolved. The mind adjusted by lowering its expectations, not in defeat, but in efficiency, conserving energy by accepting stillness as the least demanding path through each day. In this environment, action began to feel excessive rather than necessary, as though effort itself required justification, while inaction required none, reversing a balance that had once structured daily life. The option to work, like the option to refuse, faded into the background of awareness, present but rarely examined, because examining it would require a return to decision-making, and decision-making had become uncomfortable. Time was no longer divided by tasks completed or goals reached, but by quieter markers, such as meals, changes in light, and the gradual accumulation of familiar faces, all of which reinforced continuity rather than progress. What made this state so stable was the absence of consequence, because without feedback, behavior has little reason to change, and without change, patterns settle quickly into place. The men did not feel restrained, yet neither did they feel directed, existing instead in a neutral space where motion and stillness carried equal meaning, and meaning itself had grown faint. Even those who occasionally acted found that effort no longer produced a sense of momentum, because it led nowhere beyond the immediate moment, offering no lasting distinction between days. Gradually, the internal resistance that might once have challenged this condition softened, not through surrender, but through disuse, as resistance requires an object, and here there was none. What replaced it was a quiet acceptance that required no affirmation, only continuation, allowing the days to pass without the strain of expectation. The longer this pattern held, the more difficult it became to imagine breaking it, not because barriers had appeared, but because the effort required to disrupt normality had grown unfamiliar. In this way, doing nothing ceased to feel like a reaction and began to feel like a baseline, a condition sustained not by fear or fatigue, but by the steady reinforcement of routine without demand. By the end of this stage, inaction no longer drew attention to itself, having blended seamlessly into the structure of daily life, where it remained unchallenged simply because nothing called it into question. As the condition of inaction settled more firmly into daily life, the men began to experience a subtle but profound shift in how they related to movement itself, because what had once been avoided through hesitation was now avoided through preference, as though stillness offered a form of protection that action no longer could. The absence of demand created a space where remaining inactive felt safer than engaging, not because engagement was punished, but because it introduced uncertainty into a system that had become predictably quiet, and predictability had grown comforting in ways few were willing to examine. In this environment, effort began to feel disruptive rather than constructive, as though taking initiative might disturb a balance that had taken time to establish. And disturbing that balance carried an emotional cost that most chose to avoid. The mind adapted by redefining stability, associating calm with immobility, and interpreting continuity as a sign that nothing required immediate attention, allowing each day to unfold without the friction of anticipation. What made this adaptation so complete was its apparent rationality, because conserving energy, avoiding unnecessary decisions, and maintaining equilibrium all felt sensible in isolation, even as they collectively narrowed the range of possible behavior. Those who occasionally attempted to reintroduce effort often found it difficult to sustain, not because they were stopped, but because the internal reinforcement that once followed action no longer arrived, leaving effort feeling hollow and unrewarding. Without feedback, initiative lost its narrative, becoming an isolated act rather than part of a larger progression, and isolated acts rarely inspire repetition. Over time, the idea of acting began to carry an emotional weight of its own, because it implied responsibility for outcomes that no longer felt clearly defined, and responsibility, when uncoupled from necessity, can become burdensome. Stillness, by contrast, demanded nothing beyond continuation, offering relief from evaluation and shielding the mind from questions that had grown increasingly uncomfortable to answer. The camp itself remained unchanged, its neutrality reinforcing the impression that stability depended on maintaining the existing pattern, even though no rule stated this explicitly. In this way, the absence of control transformed into a form of self-regulation, as each man adjusted his behavior not in response to authority, but in response to an internal desire to preserve equilibrium. The boundary between action and inaction grew sharper internally, even as it remained invisible externally, because choosing to act now required a conscious departure from what felt normal, and departures demand energy that many no longer wish to spend. Gradually, movement became associated with disruption, and disruption with risk, not of punishment, but of imbalance. And imbalance had become the one condition the men instinctively avoided. What had begun as freedom of choice thus evolved into a quiet constraint, maintained not by force, but by the perceived comfort of remaining exactly as one was. By this stage, stillness no longer needed justification, because it had woven itself into the logic of survival within the camp, presenting itself as the most reasonable response to an environment that asked for nothing and promised nothing. In this settled state, action felt increasingly distant, not because it was forbidden or feared, but because the psychological cost of breaking stillness now outweighed any uncertain benefit that movement might bring. As the pattern of stillness continued uninterrupted, a gradual awareness began to surface among the men, not suddenly and not all at once, but in fragments that appeared during quiet moments and lingered without demanding immediate resolution. This awareness did not announce itself as regret or alarm, because it lacked the sharpness of realization, emerging instead as a faint recognition that something had been left and used for a long time without being formally relinquished. They became conscious in a distant and almost detached way that the freedom to choose had not been taken from them, but had slowly slipped into the background of daily life, where it remained intact yet uninvoked. What made this recognition difficult to confront was its ambiguity, because nothing tangible had been lost, no rule had been broken, and no opportunity had been visibly denied, leaving little evidence to point to beyond a quiet internal shift. The realization carried no urgency, because urgency depends on contrast, and contrast had been dulled by repetition, allowing awareness to exist without compelling action. Some reflected briefly on earlier days, not with longing, but with curiosity, noting how effort had once felt natural and how movement had once required less justification, before allowing these thoughts to pass without conclusion. Others sensed the change more vaguely, as a subtle narrowing of expectation, an acceptance of continuation that no longer felt provisional, even though nothing had formally declared it permanent. The idea that action might still be possible did not disappear, but it felt increasingly disconnected from the present moment, as though it belonged to a version of themselves that had gradually grown unfamiliar. In this state, awareness functioned less as a call to respond and more as an observation, acknowledged internally and then set aside because responding would require disrupting a balance that had come to feel necessary for endurance. What weighed most heavily was not the absence of opportunity, but the recognition that opportunity no longer carried emotional force, having been rendered neutral through long exposure. The men did not experience this as defeat, because defeat implies struggle, and struggle had long since faded, leaving behind a calm surface beneath which questions settled quietly. Time continued to pass without distinction, and with each passing day the awareness became less pronounced, not because it was resolved, but because it no longer demanded attention. The environment offered no reflection or confirmation of these internal changes, and its continued neutrality allowed the men to proceed without reconciling what they sensed with what they did. In this way, awareness arrived not as a turning point, but as a quiet companion, present but unobtrusive, influencing thought without altering behavior. By the time the implications of this awareness could have been examined more fully, the conditions that might have prompted examination had already softened, leaving little incentive to revisit what had quietly been set aside. The men remained where they were, not through force or fear, but through the accumulated weight of days lived without demand, days in which choice existed without urgency and awareness existed without consequence. And so the freedom to act remained technically available, yet practically distant, preserved in theory, but absorbed into a pattern that continued forward, steady and unchanged, long after the moment when awareness first appeared had passed without being marked. In the end, nothing closed and nothing changed, because the days continued to pass as they always had, shaped not by commands or refusals, but by the quiet agreement to let time move without interference. What remained was not regret and not acceptance, but a steady continuation in which effort and inaction lost their contrast and blended into a single, uninterrupted rhythm. The option to act was never removed, never denied, and never challenged, yet it no longer asked to be used, resting silently alongside the many other possibilities that exist without consequence. And so life carried on, not defined by work or refusal, but by the calm persistence of waiting, where choice remained present in theory and stillness quietly became enough. For more untold World War II stories like this, subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault and continue the journey with us.